Good evening. Today is Monday, February 27th, 2023, and this is the 139th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. Before we begin our podcast tonight, I do want to take this opportunity to remind our viewing audience out there that it was 30 years ago yesterday that the first attacks against the World Trade Center took place. It was on February 26, 1993, when around 17 minutes past noon that an explosion rocked lower Manhattan, with the epicenter of that explosion being the parking garage beneath the World Trade Center. The attack, the explosion, was created almost a 100-foot crater, several stories deep and several stories high. 6 Americans were murdered on our soil in that attack, with almost 1,000 others being wounded and injured. The leader of the attack, of course, was Ramzi Youssef, who was captured finally in Pakistan in February of 1995. Of course, this attack was a rehearsal for the 9/11 attacks that were, of course, planned again, but the help of Ramzi Youssef's uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I ask our viewing audiences out there to please keep the individuals who lost their lives and also the family members of those who gave up their loved ones to these terrorist attacks in your prayers. And remind our leaders out there, especially our representatives, that without securing our southern border, it is much more likely that these type of attacks will take place in the future. Before I bring in my special guest today to talk about sanctions and how they're affecting Russia, a message from our sponsor, Epoch Times.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read the difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
My guest today is Irene Kenyon. She is the Director of Risk Intelligence for FiveBy Solutions, focusing on providing due diligence on research, solutions, compliance, regulatory, and also reputational risk analysis for the company's clientele. With now more than almost a decade in the intelligence community and also 13 years of that in the public affairs arena for both military and civilian side of the house, her analytic experience now runs the gambit from anti-money laundering, or AML as we call it, to countering the financing of terrorism, or CFT, illicit finance, sanctions evasions, and also, of course, counterterrorism, to strategic and tactical threats to the United States critical infrastructure, financial systems, and of course, homeland more importantly. Irene is fluent in Russian. She was born in Ukraine and came to the United States as a refugee. She served in the United States military, United States Army as a journalist and public affairs specialist before joining the intelligence community as an intelligence officer. The last time that Arlene was here, of course, for our viewing audience was on September 5th, 2022, show where we discussed the relevance of what sanctions in a multipolar world mean, as we also talked through the future of compliance as a deterrent. So Irene is back here today, joining us to focus on the sanctions 1 year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and more importantly, to talk about how sanctions may have affected Russia. Irene, it's good to have you here on the show today.
It's so great to see you again. Thank you.
Irene, it's important because I wanted to bring you back. I know we've had discussions before and since the show. I think it's very hard for people to kind of wrap their head around sanctions specifically. There's a video I'm going to kind of lead off with to kind of reset the room for our viewing audience. And then there's a question I'm going to ask you that might give us an opportunity for you to kind of delve into what do really sanctions mean when it comes to enforcing compliance globally.
The Moscovich is back. This was a Renault factory till last year, but like so many Western companies, the French automaker pulled up stakes over the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Russia nationalized the plant, and it now produces the Moscovich, a brand from the old Soviet days. Some thought everything would collapse, said President Vladimir Putin this month. Nothing is falling apart. Our domestic manufacturers now have opportunities. Hardship was expected to come from global sanctions designed to punish Russia.
Is adopted.
The United Nations voted this week once more overwhelmingly to denounce the invasion. But just how isolated has the war left Russia? Like the UN vote last year, 141 countries demanded Russia withdraw from Ukraine. Only 7, including Russia, voted against. But there were also more than 30 abstentions, many African countries, plus India and China. Those two countries, with over 35% of the world's population, have not shunned Russia. Russian oil exports to China soared to 2 million barrels a day last month, and to India, 1.4 million barrels a day, a record high. Whether selling energy to China and India, or buying military drones from Iran or artillery shells from North Korea, Russia can still find partners to help both its economy and its military. President Putin met with a top Chinese official this week, a message to the world that Russia has friends. China is building new pipelines to transport Russian gas from Siberia, and Putin is strengthening relationships with the so-called Global South.
You can think of the use of sanctions as being perhaps weakening Russia in the very long term. But in terms of altering behavior right now, no, it's not going to have any impact.
Back at home, old Russian brands like Kama bicycles are having a revival. I used to ride a Kama, says Tatiana. I feel positive for our producers. Most Russians, says one Moscow-based pollster, are adapting to a more Russified economy.
They don't think about the direct influence of the sanctions or us. We are strong and we can stand everything.
The Moscovich wasn't very popular back in the old Soviet days, but in a time of economic sanctions, consumers have no choice but to consider Russian brands that they once turned away from. Eric Sorensen, Global News.
Irene, you have to explain to the general audience out there. Now, look, a lot of this is tied to the PSYOP operations anyway, I would always say. But, you could see where the Russian government will spin it as a positive. Hey, we got new brands we're creating. But you could also see the fact that the reason is because you're not getting what you were initially getting a year ago plus before the invasion into your economy. So explain to us again, if you could do a kind of a reset for us, how did sanctions work in this particular case? And if you could give us the thoughts about what was discussed in the video.
I'm sorry, I know you saw me laughing because it really is laughable. A lot of it is, I know it's messaging. But basically, there's several types of sanctions, right? There's SDN sanctions, so specially designated nationals list that blocks U.S. persons from transacting with certain people in Russia, around the world, and some entities. Their assets are frozen in the United States, any assets that they have. There's also, export restrictions. So Russia can't get its paws on certain technologies, right, on certain equipment that it needs. So, there's so much that we are doing along with partners and with allies, right? And the impact is definitely being felt, whether it's in the aviation sector, where the Russians are actually cannibalizing working aircraft to keep their planes flying, or where book publishers are summarizing popular books because they no longer have access to them, or where Russians are forced to purchase used cars. No, they're not purchasing the Moskvich because it's a big hunk of junk, right? So they would rather purchase used cars that are foreign made, that actually have all the modern components that they need than, than like purchase the Lada or the Moskvich or whatever. Russia no longer has access to the components to manufacture modern vehicles, like even seatbelt systems, right? Like, yeah, you don't need them. Russians are unable to travel or access their funds from abroad. All of this has an effect. Mobilization has an effect. Daily troop deaths have an effect. Insufficient munitions and training have an effect. Lack of pay. Many Russian soldiers are complaining that they're not getting paid. That has an effect. Last year, teachers had to give up part of their pay, and they don't get paid a lot anyway, but they had to give up part of their pay and part of their salaries to buy Russian soldiers in Ukraine socks and underwear. I mean, come on, that's got an effect. And then there's the oil caps. Like, most people don't understand how those work. Essentially, you put a cap on the price of oil that Russia is exporting, and that's the maximum that anybody importing oil from Russia can pay. So what was the goal, right? A lot of people are saying it's not effective. Well, the goal was not to cut off Russian oil, but rather reduce the revenues that Moscow gains from it. So Russia's budget is very, very much dependent on energy revenues. You cut their profits from those, and the federal budget becomes difficult to execute, especially since Russia is working to keep its economy afloat with its sovereign wealth fund, which, by the way, was sanctioned by the EU last week. Brent crude today, I was just looking at this, was trading at $79 per barrel. Urals crude was trading last week at 32. And from what we know, Russia's federal budget projections are based on $70 per barrel. So guess what? They're going to have to increase taxes to supplement. That's not going to be popular. All of these effects are meant to put pressure on Russia to withdraw its troops from all Ukrainian territories and end the war. But Russian sanctions and sanctions in general, they're a long game. And we leave room to ratchet them up, because if we throw all the sanctions at Russia all at once, it's not going to be doing anything. So we ratchet them up gradually in hopes that the more pressure we put on Moscow, the quicker they will withdraw their troops. And also, like, sanctions are just one tool, right? We share intelligence, we send weapons, we publicly support Ukrainian leaders in international organizations. And although that last bit may not seem significant, it actually is. The video of the OSCE last week of all the delegates walking out as soon as the Russian delegate began to speak, it's pretty striking and powerful. And it shows Russia that the West is actually united in its support. So we're doing quite a bit. Sanctions are one tool, but we have a whole ton of others, and they have had an impact.
A couple of things here, Irene, as you mentioned, they're a long-term game. In the video, the gentleman said that right now it won't deter anything, it seems. But I mean, we're talking about a year into the war. And I think one of the things Americans don't really understand, on the 1-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the White House, as you said, politically came out and said it remained committed to standing with the people of Ukraine for as long as it takes. Now, how do you define that? There's difference in political and sanctions. But both, as you mentioned, U.S. and the EU banned total Russian imports. And December 5th of last year, 22, as you mentioned, G7 and the EU proposed a $60 point cap on the Russian exports. But as you laid it out now, again, I'm going to go back to what was stated in your goals last time we talked about the sanctions, that the price cap policy is intended to maintain the supply of Russian oil to the global market, while at the same time reducing the Russian Federation earnings from its oil sales, particularly, as you said, in light of the elevated pricing because of Russia's choice to go to war. Now, to accomplish this, the EU, of course, and other countries that were in that point cap coalition designated the price cap to maintain the flow of Russian oil at the discounted price. For audiences out there who don't understand the nuances of this, for a layman, okay, they only see it that, okay, so you're letting him sell the oil, but they can only sell it at a lower price. Now, you and I understand the long-term geostrategic goal you're trying to achieve. But with that said, is there any way sanctions can ever be reduced in order to be able to give an out or a means to get to the negotiation tables, if that's what is required? Or in this case, the Ukrainians have said, we are not going to sit with the Russians, at least open source, to discuss anything until all Russian troops are withdrawn. And even then, the EU has come back and said that that's not a stipulation, that peace will begin even after they have withdrawn. So where does sanctions fall into this process? How do we use sanctions? Is it just an American perspective, or how do we get that coalition to know if there's a de-escalation of sanctions too?
So there's always a way to get delisted, right? It's a kind of a stick and carrot thing. So, if we delist a certain entity because they've stopped engaging in sanctions evasion, let's say. So there are plenty of times when sanctions can be de-escalated. The problem is that right now, that's not an option. Russia has made its proposals. It wants the territory it illegally annexed from Ukraine. Ukraine said absolutely not. They've had enough. So we're kind of at a standstill here. And most of our allies, with a few exceptions here and there, but most of our allies absolutely agree that enough is enough. So withdraw all your troops, give the illegally annexed territories back, and then we will remove sanctions. I'm not a policy expert, so, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, so to speak, but I would think that eventually Russia is not going to be able to bolster its economy, especially now that the EU has sanctioned its sovereign wealth fund or its national wealth fund. Mm-hmm. That's what they're using to keep its economy afloat. So that's not going to happen. Eventually, they're going to have to do something. They're going to have to stop. And frankly, you know what? Relying on North Korea for ammunition is kind of lame. Come on.
Yeah, it's not easy, especially North Koreans don't have the most sophisticated, tactical weapons out there. But I hear what you're saying. Irene, I guess the question I'm having here is, and this is what I think some of the audience has kind of struggled with. You still have ally nations out there. India is one of them. Russian oil still makes it there. If oil is still flowing, we do know that we've reduced how much money the Federation is making, the Russian Federation. Is it simply a political issue, or is there actual mechanism processes that are established out there that says if you meet this goal? Because as you said, when you have the White House says that we're going to stand with the people of Ukraine as long as it takes, and then you have the POTUS, the executive, who may not be the POTUS in the next couple of years, says that it might be a longer war than expected, might even be 2 to 3 years. How does a person in your job description look at what might be a future possible action that could be taken that might help, in this case, to possibly force not just further sanctions on Russia, but a achievement of a goal? Because standing with the people of Ukraine indefinitely, for us is not a goal thing, it's a political statement. How does that translate into a goal standing for you from your perspective? How does it translate to a sanctions execution when it comes to individuals in your job description who have to give advice to companies as far as a possible approach is concerned?
Well, it ain't easy, I'll tell you that. I mean, in terms of sanctions, we'll probably see more of the same in the coming year, right? More sanctions, more export controls, more restrictions. But here's the thing, and this is something that I keep telling clients, enforcement is going to increase, and it's going to increase a lot. Recently, the Treasury Assistant Secretary for Terrorism Financing and Financial Crimes, Elizabeth Rosenberg, she said illicit Russian money can only come into the United States if gatekeepers facilitate its entry, right? So we're talking attorneys, real estate agents and brokers, art dealers, family members, close allies of sanctioned individuals, fintechs, security brokers, management companies, offshore trusts, you name it, it's happening, right? So now the government is not only going to focus on, well, how much more can we sanction? And we can sanction a lot more. But it's also going to focus on enforcement. It's going to become even more important. So as the war continues, even unintentional violations of sanctions and export controls could really harm, number one, U.S. firms' reputations and bottom lines, right? So monitoring developments in countries such as Armenia, such as Kazakhstan, such as Kyrgyzstan, such as Turkey, the UAE, where companies are possibly helping Russia evade sanctions and acquire restricted technologies, that's critical. You have to keep track of the Bureau of Industry and Security list, the entity list. You want to avoid violating export controls, avoiding transactions with entities and individuals who might be linked to sanctioned Russian entities and oligarchs and elites. So that can help mitigate reputational risk, even if those transactions are technically legal. Here's the thing, right? Like regulations can only do so much, right? You have to have a way to enforce those regulations. And last week, the Treasury DepSec, Wally Adeyemo, he actually laid out the administration's continued strategy to erode Russia's ability to wage war. So it includes identifying and disrupting specific channels that allow Russia to fund and equip its military with sanctions, with export controls, and with punishing those who are facilitating evasion. So the United States plans to engage directly with companies and jurisdictions that are helping Russia wage war and warn them of the consequences. We have several task force. The latest one is the Disruptive Technology Task Force, which is going to focus on actual BIS restrictions and export restrictions. So it's going to make sure that none of the forbidden technologies are getting to Russia. We have klepto capture, which focuses on, evaders and Russian oligarchs and kleptocrats gaining access to the U.S. financial system. We have the repo task force, which is focused on the same thing with our allies. And then, the Europeans, they're also focusing on enforcement. EU countries are investigating this big surge, as I mentioned, in Armenia, in Kazakhstan, in all these different countries. And it's a surge in exports to countries in Russia's geographic vicinity. And that is an effort to stem sanctions evasion, because all of these restricted products, all of these exports that are going to Armenia, that are going to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they're then making their way to Russia, right? So Germany is planning to crack down on companies that help Russia evade sanctions. And that includes threatening criminal prosecution for false export declaration. The German economy ministry says that companies are going to have to provide transparent end-use statements as part of their export declarations. And those will guarantee that goods will not be sent to Russia. And if they are sent to Russia, despite this end-use statement, they're going to get criminally prosecuted, right? So with regulators increasingly focused on enforcement, these insights into end users and into supply chains and into ownership and control, all of these are more and more critical. So there are tools, there are enforcement tools, there are possible secondary sanctions for countries who continue to transact with Russia despite sanctions. There are a lot of tools we can still use, but again, it's a gradual kind of process. So the more Russia gets involved in atrocities, the more we find out about certain things that they've done, them targeting civilian infrastructure, them killing children, them kidnapping children. All of that's going to make us ratchet sanctions up, ratchet enforcement up. And it's a gradual process that takes a while. It's unfortunate, but it's true.
Irene, let me ask you this, because I want to kind of take what you said and kind of encapsulate it together in a point. And I know, we used to say that fighting a war there's an art and a science to it. And the science is knowing where you put your maneuver forces, your reserve forces, and how you execute that. But the art to it is understanding how to do it, and when to apply those type of abilities. And I think this is where maybe some of the folks in the civilian populace have a hard time understanding really what does a sanction do. On one day, you could see the effects. Another day, you see that, you have allies that are U.S. allies sometimes working with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization because they're signatory, which is led by China, maneuvering still Russian oil and other components that end up either in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA that now I know has been warned by the United States to ensure that they do not provide those components to the Russian government. But there's a piece, it was according to the data that was gathered by the Kiel Institute for World Economy, which is an independent and non-profit think tank that is based in Kiel, Germany, that the United States to this day right now has provided approximately 76.8 billion in aid. I think 46.6 billion of that, roughly around 61%, is for military assistance. And as you know, the POTUS, again, returned recently and stated from Kyiv that to U.S. media, this war may continue for a long time. Now, given all this, how does this conflict end, and what is the U.S. going to do to de-escalate with Russia, given the fact that we've frozen $300 billion in their assets from the Russian central bank? We've issued now hundreds of sanctions, enforcing an embargo, proposing that oil price cap, as we talked about, providing billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine to include lethal aid, claiming that Putin, as you mentioned, was a war criminal, and the recent visit, of course, of the POTUS to Kyiv. How's the U.S. government de-escalating this so-called war, and can sanctions be used to de-escalate a war? Or are they by themselves in a separate category based on everything else that the government of the United States does? Is there a way we can, that you see from your perspective, maybe our civilian audience will know that the two are kind of merged together? I think you've done a pretty good job as far as painting the picture that right now we cannot de-escalate on the sanctions, but how do we do it? How do we put them in a position where they say we have to take a step back? Or is it eventually going to be nothing more than just providing the lethal aid and beating the Russians on the battlefield and hoping that there would be a regime change in Russia?
I mean, honestly, if you ask me personally, I don't think there's a way to de-escalate right now until the Russians pull all troops out of Ukraine and give back the territory that they've stolen. And I've heard this from, several contacts kind of in this space, that this is the only way this is going to happen. So if they don't want to do that, which they don't, so what do we do, right? So we are providing the lethal aid, or the lethal weaponry to Ukraine. We're helping them, we're going to be helping them rebuild, obviously, but also, we are providing them with the weaponry that they absolutely need to fight the Russians. And frankly, they wouldn't have lasted a year without all the help that they're getting from the West. So, that's one. And then obviously putting that pressure on the Russian economy and continuing to do that until the Russians can't do it anymore. I mean, we're seeing it already. We're seeing deserters, and they're killing deserters on the battlefield. Even the guys that they pulled out of prison, that the Wagnerites pulled out of prison and sent to the battlefield, some of them are trying to run away because they realize this is a lost cause. Their training is terrible, absolutely terrible. They get like 10 minutes with a rifle and they're like, yeah, go fight. Like, come on now. Their equipment is terrible. They're at about 147,000 or so dead right now. Yeah. And this is, compare that to the tiny little army in comparison, right, that Ukraine has. So, all we can do is keep supporting the Ukrainian forces, keep on providing the weapons and the equipment that they need to fight the Russians, and keep putting pressure at the same time on the Russian economy so that it becomes incredibly unprofitable for Russia to continue, or nay, impossible. All right, because pretty soon when you can't pay your troops and you can't equip your troops because you just have no money left, you're going to lose.
And in a long-term war, Irene, if it does take a couple of years, it can be very difficult too, because Ukraine has 8 million refugees, and a lot of those people may not return after another year or so. So it devastates both sides. I guess there's never a perfect bullet. Some people think that sanctions could be used, targeted, and there's a debate that has always taken place, and I know amongst the people who understand how sanctions work. Others have said, yeah, just put it out there and, try to hurt the Russian Federation as best as you can. But at the end of the day, there's one guy, Putin, and he's holding on to power. And I'm not sure, if there's a standard to where we say, like in a commander's objective, when I'm conducting operations, there's decision points, right? I said, okay, I met this particular requirement. Here's a decision point. I either have to go north, I got to go south. Is there any such things in sanctions when it comes to decision points? Have you seen in the year that there were decision points placed on the map by whoever is coordinating this process? And that's something I would like to ask you after our video to come back and kind of talk about how the federal government actually coordinates this process. Were there any decision points placed on the matrix that we said, okay, now we have to go this way or this way, and then we have to go here or we have to go there? And are we ahead of the schedule with what we've tried to do with the sanctions against the Russians, or are we somewhat behind the schedule? I guess I would ask. But I do want to take your thoughts on that after we see the video, and then I'll open up to seeing how you could kind of guide us through that process.
Sure.
Ukraine boycotted the latest meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe over the presence of Russian lawmakers that they described as an affront. The event was held in Vienna. Austria granted them visas, even though they're under European Union sanctions, and despite protests from 20 countries, including Britain, France and Canada. Some delegates left the room when the floor was given to a Russian parliamentarian. Others voiced their anger.
It's a disgrace that this delegation is here, particularly the delegation that consists of members who are sanctioned individuals who voted to annex independent countries' territories: Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia Oblast, Lugansk. Those are the principles this institution was vouched to protect and guard.
Russian MPs were not invited to previous OSCE meetings in the United Kingdom and Poland, but Austria, as the host country of the organization, claims to be bound by an international agreement.
It is of course difficult to sit with Russian parliamentarians who have blindly supported the Kremlin's war, but it is important that the Russian MPs hear our message. I will be sure to let them know that we reject the war and that OSCE Parliamentary Assembly supports Ukraine.
Demonstrators also gathered in front of the venue to denounce the presence of Russian deputies and the war crimes of Vladimir Putin.
The reason I wanted to show you that video, you can see the different approaches, right? Different countries have on how to get the message across to the Russians. And other countries are not allowed to be there. Austria has chosen for them to be there so it can, give an opportunity for those discussions. With that said, though, in that year now that you've been looking at, were you aware of, hey, we have decision points, we're about to hit this decision point now is going to go probably north or south, and you were able to advise your clientele when it came to, your company's approach to how to advise them and support them? And were you able to, again, if you could touch upon a little bit from our audiences as to who was doing the coordination, who does it at the levels of the State Department and the U.S. government to give us an opportunity to get into those decision point matrices?
So, as far as advising our clients, the big thing that we do is we make sure and we monitor every single development. So, for instance, we research family members, we research jurisdictions, we research networks of shell companies and front companies. We research ownership and control. We research supply chains and end users. We monitor developments to see what entities and individuals may be sanctioned next, right? So last week on my Substack, I highlighted a company called Sunship Management based in Dubai that took ownership of a fleet of Russian oil tankers and was helping Russia ship oil, circumventing restrictions on oil imports. I highlighted it because the media reported that the EU was discussing whether to sanction it. And they did it. They did it on Friday. I suggested watching Raiffeisen Bank, which continues to transact with Russia despite the war. And it's not the first time Raiffeisen had issues with illicit finance. Having come from Treasury, we kind of that particular bank is pretty familiar to us. Researching third countries, as I discussed before. We tend to be very reactive with our designations because we don't know what we don't know, right? We, as foreign policy develops and as developments change, we adapt. So, for instance, back in when the war first began, we put financial restrictions, capital restrictions on Alpha Bank and on Sberbank. Well, 6 weeks later, all the atrocities in Bucha came to light, and it was horrifying. And a few days later, boom, they're frozen. They were blocked. So we react. Our policy kind of reacts to whatever is happening, and we continue to ratchet things up as we see the developments in Ukraine and what Russia is doing. I've always said that we were a bit too reactionary. We know how the Russians fund their military. We've known it for a long time. We know how they pay their soldiers. They're now using Gazprom Bank to pay their soldiers because a lot of the different banks have now been booted out of SWIFT and blocked. So we know all this, and we still react first. So that kind of bothers me. But at the same time, there's a huge coordination process, and there's all these different there's different equities that need to be considered, right? So when we were doing sanctions for the Crimea invasion, right? They had to be coordinated with state. They had to be coordinated with justice. They had to be coordinated with the intelligence community. So all these different agencies have equities in a particular sanctions proposal. So they had to be coordinated, and sometimes, justice has a case. They're prosecuting A, B, C, and D, so we can't sanction them right now. Or, state doesn't want this entity sanctioned because they still have to interact with the particular person that's in charge of it. There's a lot of policy considerations that kind of go into a decision to sanction a party or an individual. So, it's a big kind of cumbersome process. We try to make it a bit more targeted. We try to consider, all of the different equities that are involved. And sometimes, it'll be blocked and sometimes it won't. So.
Irene, and I think that's what I want to talk about when we come back. We're going to take a break with our sponsor halfway through the show, and then I do want to look at how does that affect us back home too.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read the difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
Irene, as you stated, it's a complicated process, and sometimes, you have to take the best interests of what someone says. State Department says don't touch the guy because we got to do business with them, regardless of the fact that it might help with the overall goal and mission set if you do sanction them. But, sanctions work both ways too, right? I mean, I know that the global aviation took a hit when Russia's aviation was literally banned from being able to be a global presence. No, that affects even people back home with recession. You've seen what happens with the price of energy, with the fact that POTUS has been now using the global reserve that we have really to kind of manage pricing back home. How do you manage that issue, especially given the fact that you have companies out there that possibly may become casualties of this war? Some of them may be by friendly fire, not maybe knowing that tomorrow there might be a sanction against a company that they've had already an agreement with. How do you manage that type of expectation, or is it something that you don't really think about in the long run?
No, you absolutely think about it. On the government side, you think about how is the public or the private sector going to be impacted? What companies are going to be impacted if we designate a certain entity? They absolutely take that into consideration. I mean, I remember being asked to do assessments about, how is this going to impact a particular sector if we sanction this entity? So, I mean, it's absolutely taken into consideration. And then there's companies who actually have existing contracts, and there are general licenses that can be issued for a wind down period. So, the general license will say this company is allowed to transact with the sanctioned Russian entity for a period of 6 months or, 4 months or whatever it is, for a certain period of time in order to wind down their business there. Is the lack of business going to impact companies? Are some going to lose money? Yeah, they are. There's no doubt. But I think with this particular issue, we have to be willing to sacrifice. We're asking the Europeans to sacrifice. They're impacted by the Russia, gas and energy stuff much more than we are. We're asking them to really sacrifice, because guess what? The Russians love to sacrifice. That video that you played in the beginning where, you have Russians talking about, well, we're going back to the old ways and we're used to it. That's exactly right. They are willing to sacrifice for Mother Russia, and they're used to it. So, we have to do a certain amount of kind of balancing, right? So, in this case, especially, if a company is still transacting with a Russian entity or with Russia in general, and it's technically legal, they're balancing, the revenues that we're going to lose with the reputational hit that they're going to get if they are found to be transacting with Russia. And those reputational hits are pretty significant, which is why a lot of companies have pulled out. They're no longer transacting, even though they can legally, they could, but they don't. And they're de-risking on that particular level because they know that the reputation is going to take a hit.
That's one of the problems that you always run into. I know that after 9/11, we put sanctions on companies and possible ties to terror networks. And then the banking systems in the United States, literally with all the regulations that were dumped on them, just didn't even see a risk to operate in certain areas. You'll have banks that get fined millions of dollars, and they look at their bottom, line and say, well, we don't even make that much money in an African nation. Why are we there to pay a fine? Just pull out. And then unfortunately, then China comes in and starts getting into those markets. I know as an example, in Africa, China comes in and goes at the lowest levels where, you have the Russians, you said they're willing to sacrifice it. Maybe they'll be buying secondhand items, for a price that they can go now locally rather than travel from location to location to purchase it because I have no choice now. Everything's been blocked on them. But if you put sanctions against the Russians in the mineral sector and you cut off their ability to be able to get into Africa to pull anything, the Chinese come in as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They do the same thing, go in there and now start really tearing apart the fabric of how the African economies run by replacing those middlemen. So it's not just a fight that's taking place between two countries on a piece of territory in Europe. It has those effects. How do we counter those when it comes to using sanctions? Again, I go back to it. Is there a decision points, or are you saying just like we've always been reactive, we just react to things and hope that our reaction actually causes a change in the thought process of a Putin who's executing a war in Ukraine?
So from everything that I've seen in terms of the decision making, and also remember, every administration has a different decision making process. So, back when Obama was president, he had us research everything. What could be the secondary effects? What could be the tertiary effects? How would this impact, civilian populations? What would this do here? What would this do there? I mean, there was literally, a request every time, hey, we're planning to sanction this. Can you help us understand how it's going to impact? With the Trump administration, it was, maximum pressure campaigns, right? So throw everything at Iran, throw everything at Venezuela. Fine. This administration I haven't worked for, so I'm not 100% sure, but given the fact that, the things that I've seen when Biden was vice president, my guess is there's a lot of kind of introspection. How is this going to affect our foreign policy vis-a-vis China? How is this going to affect the domestic economy? How is this going to impact our allies? All of this they always research it. I mean, yes, it's very reactionary a lot of times. And I as I said, I kind of hate it because, you know what's going on, and then they have to go in and they have to do all this research, and then okay, well, we decided we're going to sanction this entity because it's funding the Russian military. Well, by the time that happens, they're onto something else already. Um, we used to call it playing whack-a-mole. The media reports on something. They're like, hey, Russia is evading sanctions this way. By the time we react, Russia's sanctions evasion just went in another direction. So,
No, or the worst part is, years prior, you're sitting, you say to a decision maker, hey, sir, you got to pay attention to this. They're about to do so-and-so. And then the guy's like, yeah, not interested, next. And,
been there, done that.
yeah, all the work
Yes.
and effort, all the work you do, just see, you're like, I spent half of my life, providing the information, and nothing happens regardless. It's just a reality of working in bureaucracies. I hate to laugh about it because people are dying on Ukraine every minute. But it's a reality what we have to deal with.
It's definitely frustrating. I mean, it's frustrating in the private sector too, when you tell your client something and you're like, hey, this is coming down the pike. And then they sit around and, navel gaze for 2 years. It happens in the private sector too. But it is frustrating when it happens in government because your entire job as an intelligence officer is to inform, is to provide insights and assessments to inform policy. But, by the time anything gets done, they're already on to the next thing. And it's frustrating.
Irene, I got a question. With what is happening with the inflation, especially hitting the country, I do want to show a video and then come back and talk about that. I know that of course, the videos we're showing is how much we're taking actually steps to really squeeze Russia and isolate it from the world community. But squeezing Russia still has impact on the world inflation, the global inflation that's taking place, to include the global famine that most have projected hitting us and getting worse by 2024. With that said, let's show the video, and then I'm going to ask you a couple of questions on the inflation side of the house. Before we talk a little bit more about the issues domestically, you saw at the end of the video talking about South Africa and Nigeria specifically. Can you give us some insights for our viewing audience why South Africa and Nigeria in this particular dilemma?
Oh, you're talking about in terms of them being put on the gray list? It's
Correct.
because they have insufficient anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism regimes. So what they need to do is they put them on a gray list, which is enhanced monitoring. And what they do is they look at all the different regulations that these countries have, how they are fixing the problem with insufficient regulation. And eventually when they fix themselves, they'll be removed from the gray list. But it's monitoring.
Irene, is that tied to their relationship with Russia, or is this a separate piece between the?
No, this is a separate piece. AML-CFT, each country needs to have a robust AML-CFT regime based on the 40 recommendations that FATF has about how to reduce the risks of money laundering and financing of terrorism. So this is kind of a separate issue, yeah.
Okay. So let's bring it back home. Because at the end of the day, it's a matter of how it affects Americans. And so I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on the rising Fed interest rates and that is looming possible economic recession. And people will disagree if it's going to happen or not. And the U.S. government's ability to continue still provide, that aid to Ukraine, and with billions of dollars really going to them. How long can we keep this up with the sanctions and the providing of the monies that NATO is, frankly, in some cases not providing? Look, there's been even discussions to be able to push, Germany maybe looking at a different type of a Northern Alliance where Germany is not even part of it because some of those Baltic states are really worried about the possibility of expansion of this war. So how do we do sanctions while still providing the millions of dollars or billions of dollars that were provided to Ukraine? Is a hope that sanctions are going to be able to help win this war? Is that possible? Or is it something that we just continue to do what we've done in the past, as you said, react to what the policymakers want, depending on who's going to be in charge of the White House maybe 2 more years from now?
Okay, so first of all, let me preface this by saying I am not in any way an economist. So that's number one. So I know inflation is on the rise again, right? And there are a lot of factors. It's not just about us providing aid to Ukraine or about sanctioning Russia, because, frankly, at this point, we've really designated a lot of the entities that could impact inflation. There's rising food prices. There's higher interest rates raised by the Fed. There's a whole lot of different impacts and different. So it's
Irene, real quick, because Turkey's allowing. I did the interview last week, of course, about who's trying to push Turkey out of NATO, but Turkey's allowing Russian grain, to come through its control. When you said we've sanctioned enough on those particular issues, we're not. Are you saying that we're not going to be allowed to put further sanctions on Russia?
No, absolutely. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
No. What I'm saying is that the factors that influence our inflation really, there's a little bit to do with the kinds of entities that we have sanctioned in Russia, but overall, I mean, there's other factors, right? Core inflation is up a little bit. Food, the volatility of food and energy prices will impact inflation. And it's not just because we are sanctioning the bejesus out of Russia. It's because the volatile environment in this world. Okay, so I can't say that like the aid that we're sending to Ukraine or the sanctions that we're imposing on Russian defense industries or their minerals and metals or, their technology firms or their, hackers and their tech companies that are basically employing hackers that are launching ransomware attacks on the United States and our allies. Those, they don't really have a whole lot to do with inflation. Overall, sure, there's definite, factors that influence that. But I would say that, that we can continue doing what we are doing as far as sanctions go, and we can issue general licenses that will allow certain countries to operate if we feel it's going to be too much of an impact, like we did with what's his name, Potanin's company, Nornickel. So we can tweak those. We can issue general licenses. We can make sure and examine how inflation and how economic factors in the United States are going to be impacted by what we do. So it's not just, slap a sanction and, hey, we're done, we're good. This is my non-economist.
At least there's a thinking process behind it. Much appreciated, Irene. Irene, I wish we could talk a little bit more. Of course, we're restricted to our timeline ourselves that we have. But I want our viewers to know, with that said, if they go to the QR code, as they know, they are taken directly to your company's site, and they can look at what you guys are able to provide. I want to, again, thank you for coming on the show. It was wonderful to have you here, and we'll probably have you back again. Let's see where we're going to be in 6 months. Hopefully there's been some changes and lessons learned. I also want our audience to know that, again, because of what's happening globally, as we were talking about, we're still raising money with our 501c3 to support the Christians that have been affected in the Near East and adjacent countries, especially Syrians and northern Iraq, with what they're dealing with on a daily basis. Very much thanks to Sim Production and Fred for producing the shows for us. Irene, last words before we sign off.
First of all, thank you so much for having me on. I also wanted to flag that, we have, with all the different sanctions that are out there and all the restrictions out there, we do have this great service in our Intel Sentry, which you saw the QR code for. And I also want to tease this because it's so cool. We're actually partnering with a terrific firm on a project that will also help companies de-risk. So not only do we do that in-depth research, but our partners are really going to help reduce the risk in, when we do the research together. And they're going to provide kind of a one-click solution to that could be really, really helpful. So I just want to mention that there's a lot you can do out there. It sounds really complicated. It sounds really crazy. There's so much going on in the sanctions space, but there are folks out there who can help you with that. And I'd be more than willing to talk to anybody about it.
No, much appreciated. And we're going to have you back in 6 months. Hopefully you could give us an update where you guys are with those new projects. And who knows, hopefully peace will prevail throughout the world and we don't have to deal with it after 6 months from now.
I'm hoping so because, I've got my sweatshirt of support here. So.
Yes, I know for the Ukrainian multi of defense, it's sad. People are dying, and let's hope smarter people will come to the table and realize that every war eventually ends at the peace negotiation table, right? So hopefully this one does sooner than later. Irene, it was a pleasure having you here. God bless. Keep your people in Ukraine in your prayers, and we'll see you back again. There's new paradigms, and we'll see you back. God bless.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read The Difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.